Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. Now that the Congress has affirmed that Joe Biden is president-elect and the focus on election fraud was dashed during the violence and destruction in the Capitol on Wednesday, where do we go from here? We cannot allow our elections to be run like this. You can't allow flagrant ignoring of election laws and procedures. If we do, we're no better than Russia or Cuba or Venezuela or any other country. Joining me now to discuss where states like Michigan go from here is Robert Norton. Robert is Vice President of Hillsdale College and a former Assistant General Counsel at Chrysler. He's talking to me today in his personal capacity as a Michigan citizen who believes in the need for election integrity. So, Bob, where do the election challenges go from here, and what sort of reforms need to be put in place so that what we saw at the TCF Center, what we saw elsewhere around the country doesn't happen again?
Thank you for having me on, Kyle. Those are very good questions. And I think that you're right, they need to be addressed. I think Michigan has a long list of questions that never did get fully answered, and that's kind of a shame. I think, like you, I'm very disappointed by what took place at the Capitol. That was not at all something that was anticipated by anyone I know. And it's unfortunate that happened, but we do need to get back to the business at hand. And in Michigan's case, there's a long list of questions that have never been answered, and starting with the fact the Secretary of State needs to come in and under oath answer questions as to fundamental issues such as the chain of custody of the ballots. There are a lot of serious questions about warehouses that had some role in this, and these warehouses have been a bit mysterious as to what exactly they were doing, who worked there, whether it was paid for by outside money or not. And then once we get more information as to the chain of custody, signature validations. How were the signatures properly validated has been a central issue here. How were the ballots collected, under whose control? So there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and I certainly hope there's going to be a fulsome investigation, quite frankly, with people being put under a threat of perjury for giving misinformation.
So and you sort of touched on it a little bit, but let's talk specifically about Michigan. I think this week in the Congress, that was a time to air the evidence of election fraud. That's when I think the mainstream media would have been in a situation where they would have had to have talked about it. They've largely ignored it. They've dismissed it as, conspiracy theories and all of that. And so that opportunity was dashed. And you talked about putting Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, under oath. What else does Michigan need to do in terms of absentee balloting and how that whole process works in terms of the counting? What else needs to be done?
I think there needs to be a fundamental review of the process by which we're going to allow people to vote by mail. Now, Michigan has a constitutional amendment that allows people to vote by mail for any reason. That doesn't mean we then have to abrogate the responsibility for making sure the right people are voting, that they have the right kind of identification and signature validation, and that the whole process needs to be understood. And I think Michigan needs to also consider this outside money and influence that was brought to bear in Michigan, and to what degree is that going to be legal? We had people cloaked as being, government employees that were really funded by outside foundation money, as I understand it. And again, to this day, as far as I know, we don't even know who the people are that were involved in the process. Who was the supervisor? What was their ideology? Who had keys to the buildings where some of this work was being done, again, at these warehouses that were out there? Was there any security system? Could people come in at night and sort through that? None of those questions have been answered. So if we're going to have the mail-in voting in Michigan, we're going to need to make sure that it's done in a proper way where we all believe the elections have integrity in the end.
So the Michigan oversight committees, both in the House and the Senate, they have issued subpoenas to Detroit City Clerk Janice Winfrey and Livonia City Clerk Susan Nash. They are seeking documents. They're seeking hard drives. You mentioned the people who had access to, the boxes and all of that. They're trying to get to the bottom of that. They're asking for precinct results, et cetera. The deadline to turn over those documents is 5 p.m. January 12th, so just a few days from now. Do you feel like the oversight committees are heading in the right direction, or is there more that they should be doing?
I think they do need to do more. I think they need to look at expanding the questions they've asked. For example, finding out the names of the employees who were working at these warehouses, the supervisory personnel. I think they need to ask more about really almost every facet of this process. What databases were used for the mailing out of the ballots and ballot requests? Did we use the best possible means, or did we even perhaps intentionally overshoot that and send out lots of ballot applications to addresses, hoping that there would be the state would be awash in these ballots that would be requested, and it would be difficult to ever get to the bottom of who actually filled these things in and who sent them in. I happen to be a landlord of a minor level myself with some college housing that I own around Hillsdale College, and I received lots of these letters that said on the outside of the envelopes, election materials enclosed. And they're for people that, in one case, these are college students that rent these places. So by about 22, they've moved on. One person whose name that they mentioned, I happen to look up on Facebook, and he's in his 30s. He lives in another state. Long time ago, say a decade ago, he graduated from Hillsdale College, yet he received an application for a ballot. Now, if I was somebody who was unscrupulous, I could have opened the envelope, made something that looks like a signature, sent it in, and got mailed back to me a ballot. And I don't know if that happened or not. I think that's the fundamental issue. People who maybe own large apartment buildings in major cities, did anybody engage in these practices? I just think we need to know what was and then when those ballots came back, what kind of signature validation was performed. I understand there's allegations that software that even do basic signature analyses, that the software was turned to the very lowest settings and virtually, as I understand it, let any signature pass as being the signature of that person. Now, I know I often sign my name in a number of different ways, depending if I'm at a checkout counter of a store or if I'm, doing a mortgage application at a bank. And so these are just questions. If we're going to have this, massive mail-in voting, what level of signature integrity should we have? Should this be done at local clerk's offices, these applications, and et cetera? So there was certainly room for people to be concerned about what happened in Michigan. There was, in some of the litigation that was attempted to be brought even at the Michigan Supreme Court, there were things such as statistical analyses that showed there was between 330,000 and 555,000 ineligible voters that voted in Michigan's election. Of course, those come in different categories. Some of the easiest categories were people who only registered with an email address. And that's just a violation of federal law. It's 35,000 of those. 13,000 people who, by other public databases, say they don't live in the state of Michigan anymore. Well, now you're at 48,000. So just stopping there and looking at some of the other state elections, Georgia and other states, is 48,000 a big number? Well, in Michigan, our number, the margin was higher, but you keep adding on to where you easily could be at a point where the elections of both the senator and the president were impacted by these, tactics. I'm disappointed the legislature didn't do a more fulsome investigation right after the election. I think the legislature was hoping that somebody else might even have that ball legitimately, like the court system. But at the end of the day, I think that one thing we did learn is in the final analysis running up to what unfortunately happened at the Capitol building, everybody was focused on the fact that, hey, these state legislatures do have plenary authority under the United States Constitution. They are the appropriate place to be deciding these issues and making sure it's followed before, during, and after.
So let's look at the political reality of the situation in Michigan. Whatever the legislature passes, if anything, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's a Democrat, has to sign it for it to become law. Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who's a Democrat, says basically she doesn't support. I don't think she's going to support any sort of reform. And then you've got Attorney General Dana Nessel, who's a Democrat. She had a stack of 150 or so affidavits sitting right in front of her, people who, signed their name under penalty of perjury about what they saw at the TCF Center, what they saw in other places around the country, or around the state, excuse me. She just ignored them. I mean, they just, it was like, it didn't exist, or that wasn't considered evidence. So within this sort of political framework, if people want election reform, if Republicans want election reform, how do they get that done?
Well, first of all, the legislature still needs to do its job, and it needs to pass the appropriate legislation that they think, after a careful investigation, needs to be passed. And if the governor is going to veto it, I guess then the governor vetoes it. Mm-hmm. I'm at an academic institution, and I am here in my personal capacity. So without just engaging in red meat rhetoric here, I think just staying at a more academic level, the legislature still have their duty. They need to perform. The governor will then have to perform her duty in the way she deems appropriate, and the people need to see that. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't not pass the legislation because we've concluded what we think will inevitably happen. I think it's very clear that about half the country is upset with what took place in this election. The surveys, and I know we're all a little skeptical of surveys and poll data these days, but they still seem to show there's a significant percentage of people that are concerned about what took place. And I think it would be hard-pressed for a governor to just say, I don't care. And I think if we pass intelligent legislation that shows these are reasonable safeguards, it's going to be difficult for even the secretaries of state and the attorneys general to not give that some credence. I think COVID provided a lot of cover this year, and it was, I think, stretched. I think it was used as a means of getting around the proper procedures and rules that were in place. Shame on the legislatures again for letting all of that take place to the extent they did. But we are where we are now, and the best thing they can do going forward is to infuse integrity back into this process, do the hard work of the investigations, find out the facts the near as they can determine it. And, these facts might lead to drawing a conclusion that the election results were indeed inaccurate that were submitted. That would be worth still pursuing. I think these investigations should continue for as long as they need to continue. And in the end, the public should feel like these things were investigated. They were not swept under the rug. It's very unfortunate what happened at the Capitol. I'm extremely upset that someone was killed, or I understand maybe even 2 people were killed. That's terrible. But we need to take the moment of time for that appropriate grieving and dignity. But then we do need to get back to the appropriate work of making sure democracy is preserved going forward.
I agree. Bob Norton, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. For more of my work, go to Breitbart.com or find me on Parler, Kyle Olson 4, Kyle Olson 4, KYLEOLSON and the number 4. For this episode and others, visit thekyleolsonshow.com. This is The Kyle Olson Show.